What's going on, friends? It is no secret that every Harley-Davidson model is pretty much built on a unitized platform with the same frame and a lot of the exact same parts. A lot of the parts will actually crosswalk between many different models in the same family of generally the same years. And of course that does expand to many other years as well. But with that being said, you might think all Harley-Davidson motorcycles are exactly the same. Well, you'd be sorely mistaken, because every single Harley-Davidson motorcycle has its own personality. And I'm not just talking looks, we're talking power delivery and handling, depending on the weight and the setup of the bike. Now, while all Harley-Davidson motorcycles do share the same frame in each family, whether it be a Dyna, Softail, Sportster, or Touring model, each motorcycle is going to handle completely different, even within the same family. Even though they got a lot of the same parts, they're completely different motorcycles. This is why it is extremely important to not just pick a motorcycle based on the way it looks. Let's take the Street Glide and the Road Glide, for example. These two bikes are two of Harley-Davidson's hottest models. Yes, they look a little different, but below the surface, they're pretty much the same motorcycle. But between the Batwing fairing and the Shark Nose fairing, that makes a lot of difference. That completely changes the ride, the feel, and the handling of both of these motorcycles. Guys, if you enjoyed today's video, please don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. So the Street Glide and the Road Glide, they're basically the same motorcycle. The biggest difference is being the Batwing fairing is mounted to the forks and the Road Glide's fairing is actually mounted to the frame. Now, while this may not seem like a huge change, you do have different bars, but it does completely change the handling characteristics of both motorcycles. Now, the Street Glide with its fork-mounted fairing, this can make it kind of susceptible to the wind. If you're running down the road, you get into some high wind or crosswind, with that fairing being mounted on the bars, you can actually get a little bar movement from that, from the wind pushing back on the fairing. Not only that, if you're going into corners and you're cornering, you will feel the weight of that fairing and the stereo, the lights, everything that's mounted to the forks. It's actually quite a bit of difference when you're running into corners with the Street Glide versus the Road Glide. Which I thought was really interesting, because in the King of the Baggers series, there was actually some teams that elected to basically run the Street Glide fairing for the racing. Now, the Road Glide with the frame-mounted fairing, you're not going to have as much bar movement with the wind. What you are going to have, though, with that big frame-mounted fairing is in crosswinds and things, it's going to tend to try to move the whole bike around a little bit. But at the same time, with the Road Glide, you're not going to have that heaviness in the cornering, because you're not having to move around all of that stereo, fairing, headlight, everything else that is actually mounted to the front end like on the Street Glide. The frame itself is actually carrying the weight of everything instead of everything being placed on the front end for you to move around. Which in turn, isn't surprising that in King of the Baggers, the factory Harley-Davidson racing team actually chose to go with the Road Glide platform. The Touring platform is probably the simplest platform out of Harley-Davidson. They don't really do a lot of suspension or front end changes or wheel and tire combinations on those bikes these days. Pretty much everything's universal on those, so most of the changes are just visual cues and styling. Now, when it comes to the Sportster, Dyna, and Softail line, we do see quite a bit of changes across each model. No two of these bikes are actually going to be alike from model to model in the same family. The Dyna line has everything from long, low-slung cruisers to really performance-oriented, actually excellent handling machines. I know that sounds crazy for Harley-Davidson, but there are some Harley-Davidson motorcycles out there that handle pretty much like a sport bike. And not to mention, when you get into the S models with the twin cam 110s and the Dynas, that adds a lot of punch to those bikes. Now, one of the biggest differences between the Dyna models is a lot of the changes that they make to the front end. They put more or less rake into the front end, they use inverted or conventional forks, and also they do a lot of different wheel and tire size combinations. This drastically changes the handle of each Dyna model. A perfect example of this is the Dyna Wide Glide. This is a very long, low-slung motorcycle. This bike has very lazy handling. It's got a lot of rake to it. It's got a big 21-inch front wheel. This bike is going to run down the road really smooth, but when it comes to cornering and things, it's going to feel a bit lazy and not quite as responsive as some of the other models. Now, you compare that to a Dyna Fat Bob. This thing's got short rake. It feels very rigid. This bike is going to be a little rough for running down the road, but when you pitch it into a corner, you're going to notice a big difference. The bike doesn't really flex. It has quick and responsive handling, but the trade-off is that, as I mentioned, going down the road, it's not going to ride quite as smooth as the Wide Glide because it has a shorter wheelbase. But with that shorter wheelbase, that is the trade-off for getting that quick, sharp handling. Now the Dyna Super Glide and the Lowrider, not the S model, these are really kind of in-between models when it comes to the handling versus the Dyna Wide Glide and the Dyna Fat Bob. They're going to handle better than the Wide Glide, but at the same time, they're not going to be as quick and sharp as responsive as the Fat Bob. Now you take a Dyna Lowrider S, that thing has less rake in it, short wheelbase, inverted forks. This is going to be a night and day difference between anything in the Dyna lineup. This bike is quick, sharp, responsive handling, and not to mention it's got the power because it comes from the factory with a Screaming Eagle 110 engine. That helps quite a bit to set it apart from every other Dyna model available. Now here's where things get crazy is in the Sportster line. There were so many different iterations of the Sportster, I couldn't count them all on two hands. These bikes, they did just about anything you could imagine to them, from changes in the amount of rake, the forks, the wheels and tires, and of course they changed all over from year to year. Now every single Sportster model looks a little different. They use a lot of different seat, gas tank, fender combinations, a lot of visual cues. But even on the Sportster, it goes a lot deeper than that. Sportsters are going to give you a unique experience no matter which one you jump on. And there's a huge difference between an Iron 883 and a Sportster Roadster of late. The Roadster is going to have the most suspension, the best handling. This thing is really more set up like a sport bike. The riding position on it's pretty brutal, but it has ground clearance, which also equals quartering clearance. You have the inverted forks, you have the tall rear suspension. This thing is made to go out and carve in the twisties. But now you take a Sportster 48, this thing is low slung, it's got a big front end, this thing has very little rake in it. The handling on these bikes is actually very sharp. I can speak from experience on this one because I actually owned a Sportster 48 for a little while. The bike handled so well and it was so responsive, it was almost a pain in the butt to ride down the road. Because if you caught any wind in your arms, it'd move that front end around because the bike was just so responsive. But now if you get an Iron 883 or a 1200 Custom, these bikes, yes, same engine, same frame, similar design and setup, but they handle completely different. These bikes are so much lazier than the Sportster 48 and the Roadster. These bikes are just really made to cruise and lay back on. But you can still get into the corners with them, but don't expect a rigid feel like you would get with the Roadster or the Sportster 48. So guys, when it comes to the Softail line, we're just going to look at the Twin Cam Softail line right now. These bikes came in so many different iterations on the same platform over the years. These bikes were the true cruisers of Harley-Davidson. These weren't really necessarily performance models in any way. They were heavier with the B engine with the balancers in it. They actually weighed quite a bit for what they are, but they went down the road like you wouldn't believe. They're about as close to the touring line as you could possibly get. Now in the Softail line, their flagship model was really the Heritage Softail Classic. This was the fully dressed out Softail. This bike was about as close to getting a touring bike as you could without really spending the big bucks. Not only that, it had a lot of advantages. It was a lot lighter, but it still had the weight to get down the road. But in comparison to that, you got to think, that exact same motorcycle is built on the same platform as the Breakout. Now the Breakout was long, low slung, had lazy handling, but that thing was a great stoplight to stoplight cruiser and around town. Could you put bags in the windshield on a Breakout? Absolutely. But the problem with that is, you're not going to get that same comfort and feel running down the road on a long haul as you would on the Heritage Softail Classic. Now when it comes to the modern Softails from 2018 and newer with the Milwaukee 8 engine, these bikes are really more unitized than they've ever been. Aside from really just the gas tank and visual changes on a lot of these models, it mainly comes down to the suspension, the front forks, the rake, and the wheel and tire combinations. But other than that, they're pretty much the exact same motorcycle if you really pay attention to them. So for example, the Milwaukee 8 Softail Fat Bob, this bike is pretty much the exact same motorcycle as the Milwaukee 8 Lowrider S. Of course, yes, they do have different fenders, different headlights, different gas tanks, different seats. They look completely different, but underneath the skin, they're pretty much the same motorcycle other than wheel and tire sizes. You could actually take a Fat Bob and turn it into a Lowrider S if you wanted to. You just got to have the parts to make the swap. By having those little minute changes, it completely changes the ride and feel of each motorcycle. You can go ride a Softail Fat Bob and then ride a Softail Lowrider S, and you can't really compare the two as far as handling. They handle completely different. Yes, they're both sharp. Yes, they both run extremely well, but there's really something different about both of those bikes and the experience that you're going to get. Not to mention if you got one of the new Lowrider S's with the 117 engine, You can't really compare that to the 114 Fat Bob. It's really interesting how Harley-Davidson has such a unitized platform, but each and every model can be so different, and not just visually. It's amazing what happens when you change some rake in the front end, you change out the suspension from conventional to inverted forks, change the wheel and tire size. It completely changes the dynamic of the motorcycle 100%. This is why if you're looking to buy a new Harley-Davidson or get you something new used, it is extremely important to ask as many questions as you possibly can, talk to a lot of people, and also ride as many bikes as you want. Don't base your purchase on looks alone. You can be sorely disappointed. There's nothing, I mean, the bike could look good, but if it doesn't serve your purpose, it doesn't have the handling characteristics that you were after, you're going to be really disappointed and you're going to be out a lot of money on this new bike. So whatever you do, do not assume that every Harley-Davidson is exactly the same just because they're built with the same frame and a lot of the same interchangeable parts, not to mention even across the whole entire family of Harley-Davidson motorcycles. But anyhow guys, that's all I've got for you this week. If you guys enjoyed the video, please don't forget to hit that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. But until next week guys, you take care of yourselves, stay safe on the streets, dodge those cars, and I'll catch you guys back here next week with a brand new video. Thanks for watching.